Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest, a returning guest. His name is Joseph McBride. We spoke uh, recently about a book he published in December 2021 titled Political Truth, the Media and the Assassination of President Kennedy. But we're going to talk about another book he published in 2021. Title of that book is Billy Wilder, Dancing on the Edge. And it's a very thorough, detailed study, memoir about really an important director of so many important films, Double Indemnity, Some Like It Hot, very important cultural films. But I got a lot of background I didn't know about that. I know my parents love his films, so I've seen them in black and white, but I didn't know he had a really fascinating background. And we're going to learn more about that. But Joseph McBride is an American film historian, biographer, screenwriter, and professor in the School of Cinema at San Francisco State University. He's published 24 books since 1968, including acclaimed biographies of Frank Capra, John Ford, and Steven Spielberg. He's done a number of inquiries into the JFK assassination, which we talked about last time. And he had definitely novelist Thomas Flanagan in the New York Review of Books called McBride's Wide Knowledge of American Social History, which informs his work in the JFK assassination and in this book. But he's also written, I'm not going to list all of his books, but a few of the other titles are Whatever Happened to Orson Welles, A Portrait of an Independent Career, The Whole Darn Human Comedy, Life According to the Coen Brothers, Frankly, Unmasking Frank Capra, and then another one, another biography that ties into this book, character and filmmaker I didn't know much about, but the title of that book is How Did Lubitsch Do It? And Lubitsch ties in as an acquaintance and friend of Billy Wilder, which you can find more about that. But those are just some of the books of his long career. And this book, he can talk about that, but he has a signed picture of Billy Wilder in it. But I'm delighted to have him back. So Joseph McBride, welcome back to the show. Thanks for agreeing to the interview.
Thank you, William. It's good to be back with you. And thank you for mentioning those books. I had 4 books out since October. It's been a busy period for me the last 2 or 3 years. The Wilder book was long in the works, as was Political Truth. And the Wells book I did an epilogue to a book I published earlier. It's the first time it's in paperback. And the Coen Brothers book is partly new and partly based on a long essay I did on them in a book 5 years ago called Two Cheers for Hollywood. It's a collection of my short work, but I wanted to spin off the Coen Brothers into their own book. But Wilder has always been one of my very favorite directors, and I've admired him. I've been writing about him for more than 50 years now. My first article about him was published in 1970 in Film Quarterly with my collaborator Michael Wilmington, who died recently, and Mike and I were writing articles on films together, and we did a piece called The Private Life of Billy Wilder, which was a career overview, and we were quite young when we wrote it, but I still think most of it holds up pretty well. And I've been following him all those years. I did an essay in 1972, 73 on his film Avanti, which I like very much, which was underrated. And also Mike and I reviewed Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, another film that was, these films are beloved by Wilder fans, but they were not popular at the box office because he was, in his later work, he was known earlier for being very acerbic and sarcastic, hard-edged social satirist, but he made some romantic comedies. He was trying to emulate Lubitsch, his mentor, and they weren't totally successful until he made Avanti, which I believe is one of his best films. And it says here, wasn't he the director that got to film the alleged atrocities at Auschwitz? Well, first of all, those weren't alleged. They were real atrocities. He didn't film them per se. He worked on a film called Death Mills, which the U.S. Army did right at the end of World War II. Wilder was assigned to the army in Germany to handle the denazification of the German film industry. He was supposed to sort out the Nazis from the non-Nazis. And that didn't pan out because the Americans were trying to kind of play ball with a lot of the former Nazis especially in the intelligence agencies after the war. So we didn't denazify as thoroughly as we could have. But Death Mills was a film that another director had put together, and Wilder did some re-editing and rewriting of the dialogue, actually the narration. And it shows a number of death camps. Wilder believed his mother died in Auschwitz, but two Austrian biographers found a record at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, the Holocaust center there, from his mother's brother, testifying that she died at the Plaszow camp in Krakow, which, if you've seen Schindler's List, that's the camp that's run by the psychopathic Nazi played by Ralph Fiennes. And his stepfather died at another camp, and his grandmother died at another place. And one of the ironies was Wilder wanted to make Schindler's List as a tribute to his family who died in Auschwitz, is the way he put it. Excuse me, but he never knew that his mother actually died at the camp that's portrayed in the film.
Yeah, Amon Goth was the psychopathic monster who tortured a lot and murdered a lot of people. And it was interesting. That's one thing I learned in your book about Billy Wilder is his interest, his connection to the Holocaust, but his interest in wanting to make this film with or by himself, and his communication with Steven Spielberg. I found that very interesting.
Yeah, he this is really at the very end of his career. He hadn't been able to make a film since 1981, but the book by Thomas Keneally came out in 1982, and he tried to buy it, but Sid Sheinberg at Universal, the head of production there, had bought it hoping Spielberg would make it. Sheinberg was kind of Spielberg's patron, and Spielberg wasn't ready to make it. He kept hesitating for about a decade. He didn't think he was mature enough to make the film, and then he finally decided to make it. And during that time, Wilder had talked to Spielberg. Spielberg was a big admirer of Wilder and still is. And Wilder said, I could produce it, you could direct it, or vice versa, or whatever. And finally, nothing was happening for a long time. Wilder called him in the early 90s and said, how about Schindler's List? We could still do it together. And Spielberg had to tell him, we're in pre-production, we're starting in a few months, and I'm sorry, I'm making the film. And Wilder took it well, and Spielberg said it was the most difficult phone call of his life. Wilder loved the film. He said it was the best film he ever saw, and he wrote an essay on it, a review for a Bavarian newspaper or magazine. And it's interesting, he chose Bavaria because that's where the Nazis originated. And he wrote about Holocaust. Well, he said it really made him feel that he was there, which I interviewed a lot of Holocaust survivors for my book on Spielberg. And that's what they all told me. They told me two things. Every 35 Holocaust survivors said that it made them feel like they were back in that time and place, which is a high compliment for a filmmaker to do that. But they all said the only flaw they saw in the film was that Amon Goeth was played by an actor who was handsome, and he was not a handsome man. He was ugly and grotesque. And I think Spielberg cast Ralph Fiennes, aside from the fact that he's a very good actor, but he wanted to make him more humanized so you could understand him. His evil, if he was a caricature or just gross-looking person, people might not have been able to kind of care about understanding him. I think it was the reason. But these Holocaust survivors, and I interviewed one man whose job was he was a teenager and he handled the German shepherds that Goeth used at the Plaszow camp to attack Jews. And here's this Jewish kid who's caring for these German shepherds, and they would, Goeth was torturing and killing people, and he would sick the dogs on people, and this kid had to take care of them. Anyway, but Wilder, at the end of his review, he brought up Holocaust revisionism and said that there are people who don't believe it happened. And he said, for those people, I have just one question: where is my mother? Powerful
Right.
to the.
And it goes back to his childhood in Mittel Europa, right? So he came from that environment. He was really an exile and a refugee. And I think that theme you point out is in his life and in the films too, right?
Yeah, he was in exile 5 times over, I believe. He was born in what's now Poland. It was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Then they moved to Poland, to Krakow in Poland, and his father ran railroad cafes, and then he had a hotel in Krakow. And so Wilder lived there for a few years, and then they moved to Vienna. It turned out Wilder, it's a great city of the arts and things, but Wilder felt it was even more anti-Semitic than Berlin, ironically, where he moved after that. But he lived his formative years, or his adolescent and young adult years, in Vienna. He started working for a newspaper and magazines there, and there's a whole book of his Vienna journalism published in German that I read, and then there's a book of his German journalism, separate book, and it's very interesting stuff. And since I'm an old journalist and I like to follow an artist's progression and growth, I really studied his journalism to see how he developed as a writer. He always thought of himself primarily as a writer, but also there are seeds of his later films in some of the articles. Like he was very enamored of a girls' band and dance troupe called Tiller Girls, came from England to Vienna, and he met them at the train, and he wrote this glowing, kind of heavy-breathing article about them. He was a very free-spirited journalist. He didn't write staid prose. He wrote kind of impressionistic essays, in effect, for these papers that allowed him to do that in the magazines. And he actually fell in love with one of the dancers. His name was Olive. Then he got to Berlin because he was a big fan of American jazz. He was a fan of American movies, American jazz, like a lot of Europeans were in those days. And Wilder loved Paul Whiteman, the American band leader, who he's a white band leader, but he kind of popularized jazz with white audiences and a crossover performer. Duke Ellington was very high on Whiteman, and he was a very popular man. And Wilder just idolized him, and he talked himself into a job with Whiteman to go to Berlin with him and his band to be a publicist. And he wrote another glowing review of Whiteman in Berlin. That may have been kind of a quid pro quo, but he got out of Vienna, got to Berlin, which was, probably the most exciting city in Europe at that time, full of cultural ferment and political unrest. And they had a lot of magazines and newspapers. So he was one of many journalists, and he struggled, to make a living because there's a lot of competition, but he kind of made a name for himself. He wrote a famous 4-part series called Waiter, Bring Me a Dancer, which was about his time as a tea dancer. It's called an Eintanzer, dancing for tips with older ladies or even younger ladies at a couple of hotels in Berlin. It's really wonderful writing. It reads like a film, and it could be a film. And he told me it was partly fantasy, partly fictionalized, partly real. And for a long time, there was a debate whether was he really a tea dancer and then decided to write about it, or did he take the job so he could write about it? And he admitted to me he really was a tea dancer in between newspaper gigs, and then he thought I could write this as well, and that helped make a name for him. And then he became a screenwriter in Berlin, and I studied his German screenwriting, which was very interesting, and a mixed bag, but some good films and some not so good films. And then he came to America when Hitler took over. He went to France first. He spent a year in Paris. He directed his first film there called Mauvaise Graine, which means bad seed. It's kind of a proto new wave film about car thieves, young car thieves. A fun movie. And then he came to America in '34, and he struggled again in Hollywood to reestablish himself. Writing in a new language is difficult for anybody. And he was just another writer in Hollywood, but he started getting some credits, but most of the films weren't very good. He was kind of typecast as a writer of operettas, kind of schmaltzy Viennese type operettas, which he had written some in Berlin as well. And we don't think of Wilder as a musical director. He only directed one full-fledged musical in Hollywood. It was called The Emperor Waltz, which came out recently on Blu-ray, and I did the commentary for it, which is actually kind of a disguised metaphor for the Holocaust. It gets very grim at times underneath the surface of beautiful
but
colors.
It also kind of shows his European heritage, right? So he brought that sensibility from growing up in all these hotels, dancing in hotels at the kind of center of Berlin, brought some of those ideas to the States, right?
Yeah, he and Lubitsch both did that. Lubitsch came in 2022, and Wilder, with his dark humor, said that Lubitsch was one of the talented ones who was brought to Hollywood and didn't have to flee like I and other people did. But Lubitsch was brought over because he was the most important director in Germany at the time, and he revolutionized American films. He invented the musical and invented the romantic comedy, basically, and set the pattern for everybody. Tremendously influential, and but he also brought a new European sophistication, as you're suggesting, to American films, which were still in the throes of Puritanism and Victorianism at the time, D.W. Griffith films, etc. And Lubitsch brought this racier sensibility, very sophisticated romantic comedies and approach to sex, and the American audience really loved that, and other people began imitating him. And Wilder was doing the same kind of films to some extent in Berlin. And then when he came to America, the thing was he was typecast as doing schmaltz, and his natural tendency was more acerbic social satirist in those days, and he didn't get much of a chance to exercise that until he worked for Lubitsch on Bluebeard's Eighth Wife and Ninotchka, which was Wilder's really big breakthrough in America. It's a great film with Greta Garbo in 1939, and it established him as a top screenwriter with his partner Charles Brackett, and then they went on from there to do more films. And then Wilder began directing again in Hollywood in 1942, and then
but his ascent wasn't assured. Like he said, he was sleeping in a closet at the Chateau Marmont, struggling to find food when he was here. So he may not have been like Lubitsch, who was kind of established and moved over.
No, very, very different circumstances. Yeah. He was actually he claimed he was sleeping in the ladies' room at the Chateau Marmont. There was kind of like a parlor before the bathroom part, and the parlor or whatever you call it had a cot in there for women to lie down in, and he commandeered that cot, he said, and women would come in and go, peeing in the background and kind of give him a funny look. And he may have exaggerated that a little bit. It may have been a room like right off the bathroom, but anyway, that was kind of his low point in America. But he only was there for a brief time, but he spent some time at the Chateau Marmont. He had his own little room after a while, and that's still a famous Hollywood hotel. A lot of European people stay there, and it's books have been written about it. And
I've actually interviewed an author who Levy who did a thing on Chateau Marmont. So if people want to learn more about that, they can listen to that.
Yeah,
just look in Chateau Marmont on my show. So one of my past shows.
Yeah,
Sean Levy.
Yeah, I'm glad you interviewed him. He's a very good writer, and that's an excellent book and full of good stories. That's the hotel where John Belushi died, among other things, and all kinds of stories happen there. But Wilder, Sunset Boulevard, which Wilder later claimed as his own cinematic territory with his great 1950 film Sunset Boulevard. But so Wilder was marked by the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. He had suffered through some of that, and then he was very traumatized. In 1935, he had scraped together some money as a screenwriter, and he went to Vienna to see his mother and stepfather, and he tried to persuade them to move to America because he knew as a journalist that Hitler was on the rise and he would take over Austria, which happened not too long after that. But the mother and stepfather were older, and they were kind of set in their ways, and he couldn't persuade them to leave, and he felt terrible about them. He felt guilty about it when the war came, and knowing that he didn't know what was happening to them, and he felt a sense of survivor guilt, which never left him, and that permeates his films to some extent. There are echoes of the Holocaust in a number of his films. And the dark side of human nature, that's one of the most important things about his work, is that he was a great comedy director, but he also dealt with he made dark comedies, he made heavy dramas, he made black comedy, all kinds of films. He mixed comedy and drama very well. And I asked him in 1995, I interviewed him a lot, and I gave him the LA Critics Career Achievement Award. And at the luncheon, I said, what do you think is your best film? And he said, The Apartment. And I said, why? And he said, because it's my best mixture of comedy and drama, which is what I was trying to blend all my life.
And he got the Academy Award for screenwriting with Diamond on that film, right? Was it 1961?
1960, they got the award in 61 with I.L. Diamond for writing it. And then he also got Best Director and Best Picture as producer. So he was the first person who got 3 Oscars for one film for those 3 key categories. And 8 people have done it since, but he was a groundbreaker. So that was kind of the summit of his success. Although his film, Irma La Douce in 1963 was his most popular film at the box office. But after that, he kind of lost his connection with the audience. He was out of sync with them. We can talk about why, but I like his later films. But that is a kind of an argument I'm making in the book. His later films are it's one of his most fertile periods, unlike what a lot of people think.
Right, and he had an interesting arc because he was writing all the time, and he meets up with kind of the opposite, kind of a polar opposite of him in this Brackett character, who's a wealthy, blue-blooded, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. But they had a productive 12-year writing career together, right?
Yeah, they were a great team. As you say, for those reasons, he and Wilder were very different. And when Brackett's diaries were published recently, and they were a bit shocking because it revealed a strong streak of anti-Semitism in Brackett being a WASP. He looked down on Wilder as a European Jew, and he thought he was not as well educated as him. And Brackett went to Harvard, etc. There was a real social disdain that he had, and he didn't like some of Wilder's habits, like he was kind of a playboy, and he was a wisecracker, and he would pace up and down in the office. He was a very restless man his whole life, and I think that's part of being in exile. You never sat down. Jack Lemmon said, if there's a picture of Wilder sitting down, it should be in the Smithsonian because it's probably very rare. But Brackett didn't like that Wilder had, when he walked around, he would have a riding crop or a whip. He would crack it, and it drove Brackett crazy. And so he makes all these comments from almost the beginning of their partnership in 1936. He's saying, how can I get away from this guy? And then he never does. It's sort of like a bad marriage in a sense, where he keeps saying, I want to divorce my wife, but the next day, oh, okay, back to work,
But it's kind of like a yin and yang, because he was more reserved, intellectual. Wilder's more frenetic, better kind of sense of wit. So it seems like they needed each other, because his language skills were never perfect, right? Wilder's.
Yeah, I interviewed Paul Diamond, who was I.L. Diamond's son. Paul's a screenwriter too, and he said there was nobody more witty than Wilder, but Wilder always felt a little insecure about his English because, as Paul pointed out, his father, I.L. Diamond, who they called Iz, came over as a boy. I think he was 9 from Romania, and he didn't know any English, but he learned quickly. And kids who come over often pick up English very well, so he didn't have an accent. But Wilder came over at a more advanced age, and so he always had that accent, which was a delightful accent, but some people would make fun of him for it, and he was a little self-conscious about it. And but it made him a, quote, character. And Salka Vertel, who was an important exile maven, and she had a salon in Hollywood that Wilder and many other important people were part of it. She said that when you're a foreigner, people say, oh, you have such a cute accent, it's so funny, and it's a form of patronizing people. And but so Wilder stood out as a foreigner, and he needed a writing partner. And also he was that kind of guy who didn't like to write alone, because he always wanted to collaborate. He wanted somebody in the room to talk to, and he was very sociable. When he made films on the set, he would always welcome visitors, whether they were members of the press or just friends or kibitzers. And that bothered some actors who don't like strangers on the set, but Wilder reveled in the kind of party atmosphere. But Brackett was a novelist. He wasn't a great novelist. He was okay, but not first rate. And that's why one reason he came to Hollywood. But he had been the drama critic of the New Yorker, so he had that literary pedigree, and he was part of the Algonquin Roundtable. And so he's a sophisticated literary man, well-read, and Wilder was well-read, but didn't have that verbal dexterity. And when Wilder got the Thalberg Award from the Academy, he thanked Brackett And he said he thanked him for his patience with my English. He really helped me learn English better. And after, I think Wilder said 3 years in Hollywood, he could start thinking in English. But when he came over, he listened to the radio a lot. That's where he got a lot of his English. He would play soap operas and sports programs and music shows and things and pick up the argot. And then he would date a lot of young women, American women, partly because he was a ladies' man, but partly to listen to them talk, And so he learned, but for a while he had to write in German and have somebody surreptitiously translate his work into English to give the studios. He had to kind of hide it from the studios that he couldn't speak English very well.
Right, and that was kind of like one of his things, is that he was on exile. You call it, and I think the first chapter was Auslandish, right? So he's kind of having to adapt, but I mean, it's incredible because his early output, those movies are classics. Double Indemnity. People are still watching that today. I mean, and I think one of the things you mentioned in your book too is he was very self-conscious about not getting typecast, right? Like he didn't want to just be like a Hitchcock or something like that, right?
Yeah, he told me, he said, I really admire Hitchcock, for example, but he usually makes the same kind of film. And he said, I wouldn't be happy doing that because, Wilder was very peripatetic and had a lot of interests. And so he said also, if I feel bad, I'll make a tragedy. If I feel good, I'll make a comedy. And or maybe it was the other way around. I forget. He was paradoxical, but he liked to make a different blend of moods, and sometimes in the same film. But Double Indemnity, I mean, has a lot of humor, but it's a very dark film, film noir classic. Helps set the mold for film noir. It's a murderous couple, but there is humor in it. And Lost Weekend is a very dark drama about an alcoholic. It's a very strong film, kind of hard to watch. Good film, but he won an Academy Award for directing that as well. And Ray Milland won the Oscar for playing the part. But Wilder would tend to follow dramas with the comedy, change the pace. And Sunset Boulevard is, funny but a tragic film as well. And so he was all over the map in terms of the kind of films he made. And he liked different genres. I mean, he didn't do all the genres. He directed 25 films in Hollywood, and he didn't do every genre, but he tried a number of them and did well in several genres. That was part of his personality. And you get that partly, I think, from being a newspaper person. When I was a reporter, I'm still a journalist. One of the fun things about the job is you go to work every day. You really don't know what's going to happen. You're at the mercy, or it's the fun part is the news happens and you're sent out to cover some breaking news, or you're told to interview somebody. And Wilder liked that excitement as well, and I think he liked that in his films. He was a very, as I say, restless person.
Right, and he had people said part of his character, he was a quick-witted person, but he could also be acerbic and kind of dress people down a little bit too, right?
Yeah, he had a sharp tongue, and he sometimes could wound people with his wit. I saw him exploded a bunch of paparazzi once in Hollywood, and he was quite harsh with them. They were just trying to take his picture, and they were actually being kind of nice. Sometimes Hollywood paparazzi can be very obnoxious, but these people were being nice. But he was late for an appointment. This is after our LA Film Critics Award show. He thought it would be over before it was, but it dragged on, as these things tend to do. And while the producer of Pulp Fiction was getting his award and going on and on and on, Wilder was muttering under his breath next to me, "That son of a bitch is the same goddamn son of a," And he kept getting anxious about going, and so I helped him through the lobby. I mean, to navigate his way through the crowds. And it turned out he had a 4:00 meeting with somebody he thought might give him money to make a film. So he was naturally anxious about that, and he hadn't made a film for a while, and so he really didn't want to pose for photographers. So he really snapped at them, and it was kind of stunning. But a lot of times he would make funny jokes. But one time, for example, in Playboy, he referred to the producer, Hal Wallace, as the prisoner Fazenda, because he was married to Louise Fazenda, who was a comedy actress from the silent period, the prisoner Fazenda, which is pretty funny. But he said he told me he called Hal Wallace after that and said, "I never said that." And I apologize. I didn't want to hurt your wife's feelings or your feelings. So he would sometimes have, double thought about what he said. But he made many, many great quips, and he was a great person to interview. You would have loved to have interviewed him because he just was like a Roman candle full of wonderful.
Just constantly talking. Yeah, he insulted Zanuck. I was surprised. Like, he was pretty bold because at that time he was like one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful person in Hollywood.
Well, I think of the incident with Louis B. Mayer.
Oh, was it Mayer? Oh, sorry, it was Mayer. Sorry,
he was head of MGM for a long time, and he was in his waning period, but he was still very powerful, kind of, most powerful man in Hollywood for a long time. And Wilder showed Sunset Boulevard to a few people at Paramount, and Mayer saw it. And Wilder came out into the lobby, and Mayer was standing there with a bunch of his stooges, and he was saying, "Oh, that son of a bitch, Wilder." He was floating in the water, and we put out our hand to pull him out of the water, and we gave him a place to live, and we gave him a job, and we saved him from Hitler and all this. And Wilder claimed that Mayer said he should be deported for making this film, for biting the hand that feeds him. And then Mayer saw Wilder standing there, and Wilder said, "Mr. Mayer, I'm Billy Wilder. I made this film. Fuck you, Mr. Mayer," which was a very bold thing for a filmmaker to say, especially an immigrant filmmaker. And also at that time, Wilder was opposing the Hollywood blacklist, which was rampant at that time from 47 onward. And the Brackett book makes it clear that's why they actually broke up. And that was sort of unclear until the diaries came out, that they had disagreements. Like, for example, Brackett didn't want to work on Double Indemnity because he thought the James M. Cain novel was too sordid. So Wilder got Raymond Chandler to work on it. But the real reason was Brackett actually approved of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, forcing people to say if they were communist sympathizers or communists. And Wilder thought that was against the First Amendment. He, as an immigrant, he believed very strongly in the Bill of Rights and the Supreme Court. He said it was the most important thing about America. I wonder what he would say today. But Brackett, and he got into big arguments about Dalton Trumbo refusing to testify, etc. And Wilder said at that time, I don't want to work with you anymore, And but they still did Sunset Boulevard. I guess they had one more film they wanted to do, and they had a hard time breaking up. And then Wilder just said, that's it. And Brackett acted surprised, even though there have been many warnings where Wilder said, I want to be more free. I want to do certain films that you don't want to do. And he warned him, and then they broke up, and Brackett was really kind of bereft after that. And Wilder worked with a number of different writers in the 50s until he found Diamond, and they were really simpatico. They were both European Jewish refugees, and they both had similar sensibilities, and they talked the same language, and they were had similar senses of humor. Diamond was more of a comedy writer. He came from screenwriting and review writing. He wrote the School of Reviews for Columbia University for 3 years, and they were so good that they were reviewed by the New York Times, and they gave him glowing reviews, and that's how he got to Hollywood. And so he wasn't a literary man like Brackett, but Wilder by that time was, a master of screenwriting, and Diamond had a lot of experience as a screenwriter, so they worked really smoothly together. And all of Wilder's screenplays with both collaborators are masterpieces of structure and construction, which William Goldman said screenplays are structure. That's the most important thing about a good screenplay. And they really work well. Like, you plant something early in the film that pays off later, maybe up 2 or 3 times, and then pays off in a grand way at the end. They're very carefully constructed. Not only the great dialogue, but the great storytelling skills. And so he and Diamond were like brothers, kind of, he called them.
And Wilder didn't want his scripts changed. He didn't want improvisation or anybody to adjust the dialogue, right?
Yeah, they were very strict about that. And Wilder, some actors didn't like that. I mean, like Shirley MacLaine came from the more modern school of the Actors Studio and stuff, and she liked to improvise. And he wouldn't let actors improvise. As Diamond said, if you ever listened to actors talk, you wouldn't let them improvise. And because they both of them said, if you spend 6 months in the office writing the dialogue, an actor on the spur of the moment is not going to come up with a better line. I mean, I've worked in films. I've worked with Orson Welles, and he let me write my dialogue with him before every scene. That was unusual, but once in a while, an actor does have a good idea, and they put in some lines. Shirley MacLaine in The Apartment, for example, when they had lunch, she said she was having an affair with a married man, and she said when you're having an affair with a married man, you shouldn't wear mascara. And Wilder thought that was a great line, and he put that in the film. And then she also said something like, "Why do people have to love people anyway? Why can't we love zebras or giraffes or something?" He said, "Great, okay," and he rebuilt the set and had her say, "Why do people have to love people anyway?" You know, so he would listen to the actors, and they often rewrote the last part of a script to incorporate some thoughts. And also they were writing for specific people, and they know who, you know, Jack Lemmon and McLean were, or Fred McMurray, and how they would talk. But I was on the set of the Front Page for a day and watched Wilder shooting, which was really a great experience for me as a critic and future author of a book on him. And I noticed that Diamond would sit on the side of the set on a little stool or apple box, and his job was to police the dialogue, he told me. And he actually had to write. Normally, the writer is not even on the set, and then when they are on the set, they're not supposed to interrupt the action, but Diamond had the license to interrupt the actors, and I saw him do that sometimes. Where Walter Matthau would say a line. Actually, Vincent Gardenia, as the police chief, threw in some "goddammits" or something, and Wilder said, "Do we have too many goddammits?" And Diamond looked at the script and he ran his finger down and he said, "Yes, we have 3 dams and 2 goddammits or something." And so he told him not to say "goddammit" too often. Another time, Walter Matthau was supposed to tell the sheriff, "We're going to throw you out in your fat can," and he kept saying "big fat can." And then he turned to Diamond, and he knew the drill, and he said, "I've been throwing in a big before, fat can. Is that okay?" And Diamond sort of sniffed. He said, "Yes, I didn't say anything about that." You know, in other words, they would allow little changes that would seem more natural. And sometimes, you know, if they felt the need for adding something, as Diamond said, there was a poker game, a running poker game in that film with the reporters. He said, "That's the kind of thing where you need to write some dialogue on the set to cover the action in the poker game." But Wilder and Diamond would go off and spend half an hour, you know, writing the dialogue on the set, you know, which is unusual. But they did not wing it like some directors like to do.
And some people, I think you mentioned in your book, people perceived his films as cynical, like he had a dark kind of view based upon the films. But there's a counterpoint or countervailing point that he was really a moralist. So he was exposing these foibles, human foibles. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a big theme in my book. I'm glad you brought that up, William, because I wanted to counter, you know, one reason I write books is usually because there's some injustice that's been done. Somebody's been underrated or misunderstood for years. And even a great director like Wilder is somewhat misunderstood by certain people. He has a lot of fans, he had a lot of awards, but he has just detractors as well. And they usually say the same thing. They say he's too cynical, he hates his characters, et cetera, et cetera. And I really don't believe that. Diamond said Wilder was a disappointed romantic, which I think is a good phrase. And he said he was like Arthur Schnitzler, the Viennese playwright who wrote La Ronde, and he wrote the novel that Eyes Wide Shut is based on.
Dream story, trauma novel.
He was a trenchant observer of sexual mores. He was considered scandalous in his time, but he was very ahead of his time and a very good writer. And Diamond thought that Wilder was like Schnitzler because he had the Viennese bittersweet quality to his work, and he really understood people. And I don't think Wilder hated his characters. I think there are a few characters, very few actually, in his films who are really loathsome villains. Fred McMurray in The Apartment is a pretty unredeemable character, the way he exploits Shirley MacLaine and other women. But again, there's a moralism, and I find that in Lubitsch too, that both Lubitsch and Wilder are moralists, but they're against conventional morality. There's a difference, I think. And in Noel Coward's Private Lives, there's a line that I like where Amanda mentions morals, and somebody said, "What do you mean by that?" Because they're very sophisticated characters, and she says, "Morals, what one should do and what one shouldn't do." And I think that's what Lubitsch's films are about: how men should treat women and how women should treat men. Underneath the jokes and all that, that's a serious underpinning of his great films like Trouble in Paradise and Designed for Living and Shop Around the Corner, etc. And then Wilder's films, The Apartment is it's a morality play, but it's not one thing Lubitsch does. He's in favor of adultery a lot of his films, which is kind of an un-American attitude. That's not what you usually see in American films, because has a European sophistication. He's not prudish, and he's in Europe sometimes marriages tolerate partners having something going on the side. It doesn't destroy the marriage, and it can enhance the marriage. And Lubitsch portrays that. And then Wilder has the same kind of attitude, but he also shows how people can really be hurt by people using them sexually. And one of the common themes in his films is the clash between casual sex and true love, or sex for money and love. A lot of his films deal with prostitution, or various forms of prostitution. A man giving a woman money, who's his mistress, etc., or a man doing things for money, like in The Apartment. The Jack Lemmon character is like a pimp. He's lending out his apartment to his superiors so he can rise in the career. And Wilder, I guess, part of that stems from his experience as a tea dancer. He makes pains in that series of articles to say he never slept with the women, but who knows. But he also, when he went to high school, he said he would stare out the window at a brothel across the street all day long. And there was a prostitute who had red hair, curly red hair. They called her Red Fritzy, and he was really taken with her. And he saved up all his money to score with Red Fritzy once. And, this was when he was in high school. And he registered at the hotel under the name of one of his teachers he didn't like, which was a Wilder kind of joke. But so Wilder was very, advanced in terms of his sexual understanding of what people do, and he was not condemning sex workers, for example, like in Kiss Me Stupid, which I think is a great film. It's very underrated. It scandalized people in America. Kim Novak plays a prostitute, and she's really the most admirable character in the film. The men in the film are awfully sleazy, and the wife, it's about a man hiring a prostitute to masquerade as his wife so he can sell a song to Dean Martin. And what happens is the wife winds up sleeping with Dean Martin for a night, and the prostitute winds up sleeping with the songwriter for one night. And she says, for one night it was good being a housewife, or a wife. And then the wife says, for one night it was good being Polly the Pistol. And that outraged audiences in 1964. So it's ironic, today things have changed so much. When I show that film to my class, what scandalizes them is not the wife being a prostitute for a night, but the prostitute saying she wants to be her wife for one night, because she said she never had anybody treat her with respect, or she hasn't had a home, and but today's audience, oh my God, that's shocking.
Right, so, he kind of pushed the boundaries with kind of the sex, but it comes from his background too, right? So Some Like It Hot comes from the Weimar Republic, the kind of seedy sexual ambiguity of where he was, right?
Yeah, that was a time when they had a lot of sexual gender bending and gay and lesbian clubs, and Christopher Isherwood was writing his Berlin stories about that. Cabaret is one of the that period was like, look at Cabaret. So Wilder was influenced by all that, and Some Like It Hot is also influenced by that girls band I told you about, the Tiller Girls. They came by train. They had a very stern woman as their kind of chaperone, just like in Some Like It Hot. And it's filled with music from the 1920s. It's set in the 20s and transplanted to America, but it's a lot of it is taken from his memories of that. And Marilyn Monroe's character is, I talked to Howard Hawks. I did a book on him called Hawks on Hawks. And he and Wilder are the only two people who ever directed Monroe twice. in complete films. And Hawks said that Monroe, there was nothing realistic about her. She was a creature of fantasy all the time in films. And that's how he used her in films, and she's very good in that. But Diamond and Wilder, first Wilder put her in some 7-Year Itch, where she is literally a creature of fantasy. She's basically Marilyn Monroe living upstairs from this horny married man, and it's all they have fantasy. He has fantasies of having a fling with her, and the censors wouldn't allow him to do that. But when they come to Some Like It Hot, she plays a very realistic, very poignant character who's bittersweet. She's looking to marry a rich man, which is kind of her flaw in a way, but she wants to be treated better. And the whole film is about Tony Curtis, who's a cad, learning to treat her with respect and affection. And that's what the morality of the film is. But it's very unusual situation for American films. I remember when I first saw that film, I was 12, I guess, and I was really amazed by that film. It opened my mind. Billy Wilder is kind of my sex education teacher. I think I was a repressed Catholic kid, and I thought, wow, that film is really, really sexy and wild. And then I went to see Irma la Douce, and I had a funny experience. First time I saw it, I walked out in the middle. I was kind of scandalized by it, and then the second time, then I went back to it, and I kept being drawn to it, and I made it all the way toward the end when Shirley MacLaine has her baby in church while she's getting married, and I was scandalized by that, and I walked out again. The third time I went to it, I made it all the way through, and so I kind of matured thanks to Wilder. And soon after that, they had the Legion of Decency pledge, which they had every year. You had to stand up in church and pledge you wouldn't go to movies that were condemned by the Legion, and I refused to stand for that. My father was upset. But I had been changed by Billy Wilder and a few other things, and I was starting to become a film person instead of religious, and I broke away from the church. But so yeah, Wilder was pushing the envelope, and I'm personally here to tell you how it worked in those days for people.
Right, and it wasn't until '68 that I forgot what the name of it was, like the Decency Act. Yeah,
the production code was different.
Yeah,
Legion was a Catholic group, but they had a lot of clout. And they intimidated Hollywood, and Hollywood had to kind of kowtow to them because if they told Catholics not to go to a film, they would cut into the box office a lot. So the code was written by a priest originally, and so they had a lot of influence on that. But the production code was imposed by the studios from '34 onward, and it changed Lubitsch's films because he was very risque before that, and then he had to be more oblique and more subtle, and that actually was good for him in a sense. But Wilder kept pushing that envelope. And Wilder and other directors from that period told me that even though they chafed about the code and the restrictions, which were kind of ludicrous, like you couldn't have a married couple in bed together, even a married couple, they had to be in separate beds, things like that. But it made them think of more ingenious solutions to be suggestive rather than blatant. Showing people bouncing around in bed is not particularly sophisticated form of storytelling. And so Wilder kind of thrived by pushing the envelope. I see him as the bull in the china shop of American Puritanism. But when the code was abolished in '68 and the rating system was imposed, which has its own problems, the china shop, all the crockery was broken, and anything went for a while. You know, they made Midnight Cowboy and Easy Rider and all kinds of racy films and films with profane language, you know, like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, etc. And Wilder didn't want to do that explicit kind of stuff. He didn't think it was witty or funny, so he became more openly romantic. He was like a closet romantic, and his romanticism came out of the closet. And he made, he was kind of also traumatized by the reaction to Kiss Me Stupid, which was pretty, you know, raunchy film. But it was a restoration comedy, as Diamond said, and the audience didn't get it. But then they made The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, which is a beautiful film, and they spent 10 years writing that, and it was a lovely, bittersweet, romantic film. And unfortunately, the Marish Company cut a lot out of it after some bad previews, and Wilder was kind of forced to acquiesce. And they cut out a couple of humorous episodes at the beginning that are a loss. But the biggest loss they cut out a flashback in which the whole film is about what is Sherlock Holmes's attitude toward women. You know, some people also say that Wilder is a misogynist. I don't think he is. I think he criticizes both men and women equally, and he doesn't sentimentalize women. And Molly Haskell, who's a great writer about women in film, said in my book that one reason Wilder is so modern today is that he doesn't sentimentalize women like a lot of the films did in the old days, and we look back at them and we think they're kind of phony or limited. But Wilder didn't hesitate to criticize women, but there are only about 3 women in his films who were just out and out nasty people: Barbara Stanwyck in Double Indemnity, Jan Sterling in Ace in the Hole, and Judy West in Fortune Cookie. The rest are a mixed group of real people, and some of them are very good people, like Betty Schaefer, the story editor in Sunset Boulevard, is my favorite example. And Shirley MacLaine and Nancy Olson plays that character. Shirley MacLaine is a wonderful character in The Apartment. She's flawed, but you love her. You understand why she's falling for the wiles of this married man, and doesn't understand that the guy who really loves her is the one she should be with until toward the end of the film. But she's a very real person. And when my students saw that film recently, they said, wow, that film is so modern. It's just like sexual relationships today. And they were really impressed. So that's kind of what Wilder brought to American films.
Right, and you can just see that. You can see that kind of different mores, different sensibilities, definitely more European, breaking down the kind of Puritanism that lasted really to the 60s, I think. So, really fascinating.
After the code broke up, he had to kind of, as I say, he went very romantic. But in Sherlock Holmes, I was going to mention, there's a scene in there where he falls in love with a spy who's, in effect, a prostitute for Germany, who's seducing him as a spy, and he's tricked by her. And he explains why he has a negative view of women, that when he was at Oxford, he won a crew race. He was the captain of the crew, and as a reward, his team bought a prostitute's services for him. And he had been worshiping from afar this beautiful blonde who would go to church with a bunch of other girls and things like that. He would see her from afar. And then when he gets the prostitute, he's very shy, and she turns around and she's the girl that he's been worshiping and idealizing, and that's a terrible shock to him, and he runs out. And Maurice Zolotow, who's one of Wilder's biographers, claimed that Wilder had a similar experience as a young man, that he was in love with a girl named Ilsa, who he had idealized, and then his friend said she was turning tricks in the local park, and he went there and was terribly disillusioned. But I asked Wilder about that, and he said, absolute bullshit, never happened. He said, as a young man, I wouldn't sleep with a prostitute because, you'd get syphilis, number one, and number two, I couldn't afford it. But he didn't actually deny the story, and actually the Red Fritzy story kind of belies the thing that he wouldn't sleep with a prostitute and didn't have the money. And he admitted to Kevin Lally, another biographer, that, I did date this girl, Ilsa, but I knew she was a hooker. It's a different version of the story, but something like that happened to him. And so that's a really tragic loss in Sherlock Holmes, that scene, which was very short. They could have kept it, is missing. I have a still from it in my book, Billy Wilder Dancing on the Edge. But then he did Avanti, which was a very romantic film about a guy who's sort of callous and just believes in extramarital sex without emotional entanglement. Jack Lemmon's character, an American businessman, what we call the ugly American kind of character. Wilder had a lot of them in his films. And he goes to Europe, and he meets this young, attractive English woman who is more open about sexuality, and they have a romance, reenacting the romance of their dead parents. It's a beautiful, tender film that looks back to the traditions of Lubitsch and all that. But in 1972, the word romantic was kind of a dirty word. If people wanted to put you down, they'd say, oh, you're a romantic. Like that meant that you didn't understand life or something, because free love was the big thing. And Wilder was against that concept because he believed in emotions. And so that's why he's not a cynic or misogynist. He believes in people treating each other decently, and he cares about the emotions of both genders. And And also he's interested in things like cross-dressing and masquerading is a big theme in his life.
Right. You said masquerades are a very important theme, or people masquerades of the individual characters too, putting on kind of a masquerade.
Yeah, there's so many instances. Almost every Wilder film is kind of a masquerade of some kind, or a con game of some kind, where people are fooling people by being something they aren't. And I thought about that for a long time, and then I realized, oh well, that's common to exiles. And I read a lot about exiles, and people say that when you're in exile and you come to a new country, you are masquerading whether you want to or not. And in fact, because you're adopting the language and customs of a new country, and sometimes the clothing or the jobs or whatever. And you have to do that to survive in the country. Some people are more able to do it than others, and some people resist it. But Wilder wholeheartedly became an American, but he was still a European. And his later work, when Hollywood was not financing him much, he became a European filmmaker again. And so he deals a lot with masquerading, but that also is a way in which he deals with people fooling people and exploiting people, and then getting their comeuppance. Fedora, his last good film, is all about masquerading. It's about an old actress who her face has become disfigured through plastic surgery, bad plastic surgery, and so she turns her daughter into a facsimile of herself and passes off her daughter as herself. And people marvel at how youthful she looks and all, but it's a terrible masquerade. It ruins this young woman's life. And it's a tragic film, and it's a dark film about the film business. And it's related to Sunset Boulevard, but even more tragic. And that's a fascinating film, flawed film, but fascinating.
And he kind of had that whole theme of disillusionment as well. And some people, I think, you compare him to Peckinpah in some ways, because as somebody who was contemporary, they had kind of a broken-hearted view of the world. Like,
Yeah,
this is how grim it can be.
that's a good point. I said to Wilder once, kind of without thinking, I referred to cynicism in his work, and he says, "But if I'm cynical, what adjective do you have for Peckinpah pictures?" I thought it was a great line. That's his great wit. And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way. Cynical is just another word for realistic, isn't it?" And he said, "Yeah, every play by Ibsen was cynical, right? Every play by Strindberg was cynical." And what was the thing you were mentioning that?
Just like the broken heart, and also disillusionment. People got disillusioned with things, or they had to adapt to the corruption of the world and how they manage that.
Yeah. Another critic had a good point. There was a broken heart in Wilder that he said made him very poignant, and he was not hard-hearted, cynical guy. His broken heart was constantly on display, and the characters' hearts are often broken because they either start out by being idealists, or they've been jaded, and then they succumb to love. He deals a lot with people who have the broken heart. And this critic was saying, I see the broken heart in Peckinpah on display, even though he was a very violent filmmaker. But the characters are fascinating because they're complex. But he said, I don't see the broken heart in, say, Robert Altman. A lot of modern filmmakers they're not as much into vulnerability as Billy Wilder was. And that's one of the qualities that I really love and admire about him. And you love a lot of his characters, and you understand them. Even a terrible person like Barbara Stanwyck in Double Indemnity, you sort of understand why she's doing what she's doing to get out of this bad marriage. She's going to kill her husband. But then Fred McMurray is a great piece of casting. He's a likable fellow, a kind of all-American guy. And Wilder had written, one of the interesting discoveries, I saw a film called Champagne Waltz in the 30s that Wilder had co-written. It was rewritten after he left, but it's the first Wilder character in an American film. Buzzy Ballou is a character played by McMurray, who's kind of a wisecracking, gum-chewing jazz man who goes to Vienna, and he puts a Viennese waltz palace out of business, and he feels guilty about it because of the young woman he's getting interested in, and he's ruining her business. So then she goes to America with him, and they kind of combine jazz and Viennese waltzes in a kind of unlikely combination. But it's a very Wilder character, and his love of music, which is one of the great things about his films. He always picked the right songs for his films with a lot of resonance, a lot of symbolism, and his use of background scores. He picked great composers to work with. So the McMurray, he saw the darker side underneath the surface charm, and he used him in Double Indemnity as kind of a regular guy. We could all kind of relate to this guy, but he succumbs to lust, and he wants to outwit his father figure, who's great performance by Edward G. Robinson, who's a great insurance investigator. And McMurray, like a lot of people, thinks he can outwit somebody who's really brilliant, and then he fails. Although he does outwit him for a while. And it's really, as Wilder said, it's a love story between two men, not between the man and the woman. They have a murderous relationship, but he betrays his father figure, and it's a very poignant ending where they kind of express their love for each other in oblique ways. It's very, very moving film.
Joseph, we are at about 60 minutes. Is there anything you'd like to add or anything I missed? I mean, really fascinating discussion and great book, very detailed. I learned so much it's over 500 pages, but Billy Wilder is really a fascinating figure. I didn't know his childhood background. I knew he was from Germany, but I didn't know a lot of the details about that. But what would you like to add?
I really like to go into the backgrounds of characters. I've done that with Spielberg and Lubitsch and Ford and Wells. And one thing I'll say is Wilder's German films are not seen very much, and some are really hard to see. I had to go to Germany to see some, and some you can get copies, through the collector network. But he did a marvelous film called People on Sunday in Germany. He was the main writer on that, and it's kind of a neo-realist film about ordinary people on a bittersweet weekend jaunt. And they cast non-actors for the roles. It's really a terrific film, and Criterion has a disc of that. And then he did Emile and the Detectives, which is based on a children's novel that's very good about a gang of children who outwit a crooked adult. And there have been several versions of that. Wilder's is really terrific. And then he did a film called The Blonde Dream, if anybody can dig that one up. It's just a very moving film. It's a mixture, like when he was in Germany, the head of the UFA company was a Hitler sympathizer, and he made them put in sort of conformist elements and songs extolling conformism and how we're all happy even though we're poor and all this kind of nonsense. But the main character is a woman who wants to go to Hollywood, and so this fascinating scene Lillian Harvey plays, and she's marvelous. She goes to Hollywood in a dream sequence, and it becomes a nightmare for her. It's kind of like Sunset Boulevard, where the men treat her really badly, and this is so contemporary because it's just like the Me Too movement in Hollywood. And she winds up staying in Germany, which is kind of a depressing ending, but it's a very interesting film. She has some very beautiful songs in the film. And so he did some good films. He made another one called Scampolo, which is a girl of the streets, a good film. And Dolly Haas is very much like Audrey Hepburn, who Wilder directed later. So it's worth exploring the more obscure Wilder films. So I really paid attention to all those films that he wrote before he became a director, which, you don't really understand him if you just look at the films he directed. You have to understand, okay, how did he get to be that very assured guy when he started directing in Hollywood with the major and the minor? He was already very accomplished, and how did that happen? And I delve into that. I find that really interesting. I think most people like to know that.
I did, for sure. I mean, I was interesting. I was looking at the movies he had made and checking on YouTube. So I saw some of them. One was was it Weekend? I forgot what it was about. A weekend with a guy and a girl. That's on YouTube. So some of it is
Sunday, I think, is the one. Yeah, it's a weekend. It's in the Wannsee district of Berlin, which is kind of the resort area. And one of the chilling things about that film, that's where the Holocaust was planned at the Wannsee Conference in 1942. There have been two movies about that. It kind of, our knowledge of what happened to Germany shadows some of those early films. Wilder made a great film in 1948, which most people don't know about, called Foreign Affair, with Jean Arthur and Marlene Dietrich and John Lund. It's about an American congresswoman who goes to Germany, and she's kind of like Sarah Palin, a conservative, prudish congresswoman, investigating the morale of GIs who are all, fooling around with German women and selling stuff in the black market. And Wilder has a very tolerant attitude toward a lot of that, and the Congresswoman is sort of opened up by it. She's like one of his ugly American characters who becomes her deeper feelings come out, and she falls in love with this GI who's kind of fooling her, and it's a marvelous film that Wilder and Brackett did. Brackett was nervous about the subject matter. That's one of the really edgy political films that Wilder made that got some criticism for them. But today it looks very refreshing. It's so realistic and so truthful about the post-war period and all the corruption that went on.
Right, yeah. Excellent book. Really fascinating. And you can tell your knowledge of the film industry, and you bring in so many of these other characters that I know about. Isherwood, Sturgis, that really makes for a great read. Great history book as well, cultural book. Where's the best place to get this book, Billy Wilder, Dancing on the Edge?
Well, it's from Columbia University Press. You can buy it on their website, or you can get it from Amazon or Barnes & Noble. And it's been available since October. And bookstores, there aren't too many bookstores left, but they have it in some bookstores. But you know, Columbia University Press website is a good place to get it. Or whatever. So
and then Joe, sorry, please continue.
No, I hope people read it because it's.
I hope so too. Yeah. It's really fascinating. And where's the best place for people to reach out to you if they want to contact you? Do you have a website or social media?
Well, I had a website, and then I got so busy the last 3 years or so. I was doing 4 books. I neglected to renew the website, josephmcbridefilm.com. So it disappeared, unfortunately, and I've got to get a new one put up. I've been so busy, I haven't had a new one put up. I have websites for some of my other books, like Into the Nightmare and How Did Lubitsch Do It and The Broken Places. But in Political Truth, The Media and the Assassination of President Kennedy, which I think is a book that I care deeply about. I put many years of research into that book and the whole subject of the assassination. I've been studying for decades. In the acknowledgments, or in the front of the book, I have my address because it's self-published through a fulfillment house, and you can only get it through Amazon. But on the copyright page, it has my address and my email. I'm at joemac809 at gmail.com. joemac 809 at gmail.com. I like hearing from readers. It's one of the pleasures for an author is getting feedback from readers. I really appreciate it when somebody writes me. I think that's very nice. I'm not doing in-person events right now because of the pandemic, but one of the pleasures for a writer is when you write a book, they let you out of your cage for a while and you get to go and meet your readers at signings and things, and I'm not doing that right now. But you write for the unknown reader, the ideal reader, and then it's very nice when you meet the actual people and get their reactions to the books.
Good point. And I actually came across your name in my GFK researches because you were trying to ask former President George H.W. Bush where he was. I think you had some kind of interaction. I saw that on a different documentary. So,
yeah, I was the guy who exposed Poppy Bush's early CIA connections, which he still denies. In The Nation, I did some research on him back in the 80s, and I have 35 pages Into the Nightmare on Bush's CIA background and his involvement with the Kennedy assassination. This has sort of changed Bush research. And so those 2 books on the assassination are very, very important to me. And I really appreciate your broad range of interest that you're interested in that and the film books too. And I film is my kind of official job, but the Kennedy assassination is sort of my real avocation in life. But I do both. I'm fascinated by both areas. So I like to go back and forth. And I write other kinds of books too, but those are the 2 areas that I focus on.
Keeps you nimble, right? Yeah. So people can go back and listen to the earlier discussion you and I had: Political Truth, The Media and the Assassination of President Kennedy. Another very superbly detailed book about all of your research. So both these books, you have their commonalities. Great writer too. You're a superb prose writer too. So
thank you so much.
Kudos to you. So again, people go get this book. Title is Billy Wilder, Dancing on the Edge by Joseph McBride. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me back. I appreciate it.
All right, take care.
See you later.
All right, see you. Stay there.